Investigators have to rely on the next best thing, the tapes from the air traffic control tower. 33 seconds before the collision. The tapes reveal that after reading back his ATC clearance, the KLM co-pilot makes an unusual statement.
We're now at takeoff.
American investigator Bill Edmonds is puzzled by what he heard.
We couldn't understand exactly whether he was saying we are at takeoff or we are taking off. If we are at takeoff, that means we're ready to take off, or the other would be that they're actually in the process of taking off.
The Spanish air traffic controller also seems confused by what the KLM co-pilot has just said.
Okay, stand by for takeoff.
I will call you.
Stand by is the last instruction from the tower to the KLM. They never issue takeoff clearance. Nevertheless, Captain Van Zanten accelerates down the runway. The control tower tapes seem to suggest that the Dutch pilot has made a serious error of judgment.
This man, for reasons that we'll have to investigate, took off without permission.
Van Zanten is one of Holland's star pilots. He was so highly regarded that KLM used his face in their advertising. He'd been a commercial pilot for 27 years. It's shocking that such an experienced pilot would make such a drastic error. Meanwhile, the tower tapes reveal another startling fact. The Pan Am pilots had not followed their instructions either. 4 minutes before the crash, the control tower instructs the Pan Am to turn off the runway at the third exit. But investigators now know that the planes collided further up the runway, near the fourth exit. Why did the Pan Am captain miss his turnoff? Investigators now examine the exact position of the planes on the airstrip moments before the crash. The Pan Am crew are using a small diagram to help them locate exit C3, but the exits are not clearly marked, and visibility is getting worse. But exit C3 would have required the jumbo to make a very difficult turn at an acute angle. The American investigators believe it was a practical impossibility, and the crew may have thought so too.
The geometry that we drew out indicated that the Pan Am aircraft could not have made it.
But American investigators believe there's another reason why Captain Grubbs misses the C3 exit. Just at the time he should be leaving the runway at exit C3, the Pan Am pilot is distracted by what he hears on his radio.
KLM 4805 is now ready for takeoff and we're waiting for our ATC clearance.
They probably would have been listening to the KLM aircraft rather than concentrating on turning off on the taxiway.
35 seconds to go. The KLM co-pilot tells control.
We're now at takeoff.
Immediately, the Pan Am co-pilot butts into the conversation.
We're still taxiing down the runway, the Clipper 1736.
Inside the KLM, they should hear that the Pan Am jumbo is still on the runway ahead of them. But Captain Van Zanten accelerates down the airstrip. Investigators now know that none of the pilots on either plane followed the controller's instructions. To find out why, investigators have to dig deeper. It may boil down to the behavior of the two crews. So far, investigators have relied upon tapes from the control tower. But 2 weeks into the investigation, they can finally examine the tapes from the black boxes. Each 747 has 2 black boxes, the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, which stores the final 30 minutes of all conversations inside the cockpit. Only when investigators compare the black box tapes from the 2 planes with the recordings from the control tower do they get the full story. In the KLM cockpit, the crew didn't hear certain directions that were clearly audible on the control tower tapes. Just when Captain Van Zanten most needed his radio communications, a loud squeal obliterated vital messages.
Comat from 1736 report.
Patrick Smith is a commercial pilot who studied many air disasters.
Communicating to air traffic control the way we do is just so second nature. You don't think of it potentially being something that could break down and kill you. Here, a very simple technological problem lent a hand to this massive accident.
Airplanes communicate with air traffic control using two-way VHF radios. All the planes at the airport tune into the same frequency, so that not only can they receive their instructions, they can also hear what's going on around them. But the system has limitations.
The best way to picture it is if anybody's ever used a walkie-talkie, you click and you speak.
Only one person can speak on that frequency at a time. A problem occurs when two or more people try to use the frequency at the same time. It causes a loud, noisy squeal, known as a heterodyne.
Hearing a heterodyne on an open frequency is 999 times out of 1,000. It's an innocuous phenomenon.
But the accident at Tenerife was that 1 in 1,000, where the heterodyne was not harmless. 44 seconds before impact. While the KLM co-pilot is reading back the ATC clearance to the controller, the data recorder reveals that Van Zanten has already begun to accelerate. He doesn't wait for the co-pilot to finish. 37 seconds. The Pan Am Jumbo is still taxiing on the runway. From the tower tapes, investigators know the controller told the KLM plane to wait for takeoff clearance.
Okay, stand by for takeoff. I will call you.
At that exact moment, the Pan Am cockpit tapes reveal that the Pan Am crew also respond.
We're still taxiing down the runway, the Clipper 1736.
They're both responding at the same time. But the KLM cockpit tape reveals that because both Pan Am and the controller speak at the same time, it creates a heterodyne.
Okay.
Captain Van Zanten simply hears the word, OK. He doesn't hear the controller.
Okay, stand by for takeoff. I will call you.
Nor does he hear the Pan Am.
We're still taxiing down the runway, the Clipper 1736.
He continues accelerating down the runway.
Either one of those statements should have stopped him in his tracks, but because those two transmissions were made simultaneously, all he heard was a garbled noise.
Okay, stand by for takeoff. I will call you.
Just 28 seconds later, the KLM Jumbo smashes into the Pan Am. The Dutch investigator feels that this discovery has cleared Van Zanten of any blame.
I'm pretty sure that if the KLM had heard these messages, he would not have continued its takeoff.
The interference happened 30 seconds before impact, blocking two vital messages. But even after that, the cockpit tapes reveal that Van Zanten had one final warning. 24 seconds before the crash, the Spanish controller makes a second call to Pan Am about its status on the runway.
Papa Alpha 1736. Report runway clear.
The Pan Am co-pilot responds.
Okay, we'll report when we're clear.
This conversation was definitely audible in the KLM cockpit, but only one member of the crew was aware of it.
The flight engineer understood it at least partially.
The Pan Am, is he not clear?
The captain that is in the middle of the takeoff said something like, "What'd you say?"
What did you say? The Pan Am, is he not clear?
Van Zanten replied emphatically,
"Oh yeah."
Oh yeah.
And then flight engineer doesn't reply anymore.
The flight engineer was the most junior member of the crew.
The Pan Am, Is he not clear?
Dismissed by his highly respected captain, he doesn't question him further. Both the Spanish and American investigators are critical of Captain Van Zanten's performance that day. However, investigators now discover that he made one final attempt to avert disaster. Just seconds before he slammed into Pan Am, Captain Van Zanten tried to lift the KLM plane over the top of it. He pulled the nose up so sharply that the tail scraped the runway. He nearly made it. The nose and front wheel cleared the Pan Am, but the Jumbo still couldn't climb high enough. The disaster at Tenerife was caused by a chain of events combining both human error and technical failure.
Heterodynes are preventable. There is a blocking device that can be inserted into the communication systems of airliners that prevents simultaneous transmission.
However, although some airlines are voluntarily installing them, it's not yet a legal requirement. Investigators finally pieced together the critical events that led to the tragedy at Tenerife. First, the air traffic controllers instructed two 747s to taxi onto the same active runway at the same time. Then, in heavy fog and confused by the runway layout, the Pan Am pilot missed his exit and taxied too far. Just seconds later, Dutch pilot Captain Van Zanten began his takeoff without clearance. Finally, a loud squeal in the KLM cockpit prevented the captain from receiving vital messages which may have stopped him in his tracks. Back home in San Diego, Jack's story made the news.
Jack Ridout is a survivor and is credited with the rescue of a dozen other passengers on a Pan Am 747, the nightmare of Tenerife.
I live with the images probably for the first year, every night, most nights.
A new airport in the south of Tenerife now handles the majority of the island's visitors. Built at sea level, it rarely suffers from fog. Tenerife's old airport remains open, and the authorities have installed a ground radar system. Today, a vast increase in tourism has seen the return of large aircraft, both landing and taking off, in the fog at Tenerife's Los Rodeos airport. 12:30 p.m. Suddenly, Pan Am's captain, Victor Grubbs, receives an urgent message from air traffic control. A bomb has exploded at Gran Canaria Airport where he's due to land. He must now head for Los Rodeos Airport on the nearby island of Tenerife. 1:38 p.m. Another jumbo, KLM flight 4805 from Amsterdam, is also diverted to Tenerife's Los Rodeos Airport. Tenerife Airport is small. There's only one airstrip, and the air traffic controllers are not used to so many aircraft, let alone jumbo jets. 2:15. The Pan Am 747 touches down. It joins the KLM on the tarmac, waiting for Gran Canaria's airport to reopen. Tenerife's Los Rodeos Airport is situated in a valley, in the shadow of the great Mount Teide, the third largest volcano on Earth. Low-lying clouds frequently roll down the mountains, shrouding the airport in heavy fog. Los Rodeos Airport opened in 1941. Facilities are severely limited. There's no radar to monitor planes on the ground. With 5 big jets now diverted there as well, the airport can barely cope. 2:30 p.m. Police in Gran Canaria have cleared the bomb. But even though the Pan Am plane is ready to take off, it can't. The KLM Jumbo, ahead of it on the taxiway, is refueling. At 4:56 p.m., KLM's most senior pilot, Captain Jacob Van Zanten, requests permission to taxi.
4805 is now ready for takeoff.
2 minutes later, air traffic control gives the go-ahead. On the Pan Am, Jack notices a change in the weather.
The fog started rolling in, and it was quite unusual to me because it would completely consume the airport.
The KLM 4805 taxis down the runway. There are 248 passengers and crew on board. Visibility is now down to 300 meters. None of the air traffic controllers can see the planes that they're directing. And there is no ground radar to help them. They are now totally reliant on communicating by radio. 5:02 p.m. The controllers give Pan Am permission to taxi onto the runway right behind the KLM. The Pan Am pilots are then told to turn off at the third exit and wait. Conditions are getting worse by the second. 5:04. The KLM is getting into position for takeoff. The Pan Am is still taxiing towards the KLM along the runway. The pilot and co-pilot are trying to find the third exit, but they're not familiar with the airport and can barely see out of their cockpit windows. 5:05. The KLM is in position. The 747 starts heading down the runway towards the Pan Am, which is still on the airstrip, just 1,400 meters up ahead. (5:06 and 18 seconds). The control tower tells the KLM crew to wait.
Okay, stand by for takeoff. I will call you.
But they don't. Instead, Captain Van Zanten accelerates the KLM Jumbo down the runway. 5:06 and 45 seconds. The Pan Am co-pilot looks out of the window and is horrified by what he sees. The 300,000 kilogram KLM Jumbo is heading straight towards him. Pan Am's Captain Grubbs forces the engines to full throttle. He tries to move the 747 out of the way.
Get up! Get up!
But it's too late. 5:06 and 50 seconds. The KLM smashes into the American Jumbo at 290 kilometers per hour.
Just a shattering noise. Then almost immediately the fire broke out.
The KLM 747 has careered into the Pan Am, slicing off the upper deck. After the impact, the KLM crashes further down the runway. The tower controllers sound the alarm. These first news pictures show the firefighters tackling the blaze which has engulfed the KLM. They can't find any survivors. Because of the fog, they have no idea that just 450 meters up the runway, the Pan Am Jumbo is also in flames, with hundreds of people still on board. Jack Ridout immediately sets about helping other passengers.
There was raw fuel, and I had it all over me. I was drenched in it. I thought, we got to get these people out of here. So I started just literally slinging people out that door.
Another explosion blasts Jack out of the plane.
We kind of staggered as far away from the plane as we could, and then finally the last explosion just took everything out but the wings.
Of 396 people on board, there are just 61 survivors. Jack Ridout helped to rescue 12 people. He's left with third-degree burns on his head and arms. Everybody on the KLM 747 and most of those on the Pan Am have perished in the crash. It's the worst aviation accident in history. In all, 583 people have lost their lives. Now we rewind the events of that fateful day and go deep into the investigation to reveal what really happened. Advanced computer simulation will take us where no camera can go, into the heart of the disaster zone. The Spanish immediately bring in a team of specialists. Accident investigator Jaime Velarde hits the ground running.
That is very important in an accident investigation, to be as fast as possible, as rapid as possible, because you see and photograph any evidence in his natural state.
Investigators arrive from America and the Netherlands, representing the two countries whose planes have crashed. The first task is to find the black boxes. They contain vital voice recordings from inside both cockpits, as well as all the technical data. The investigators soon recover them, but there's a setback. The boxes are badly damaged. It may take weeks to decipher the recordings.